The drums of Tenochtitlan echoed like thunder across the Valley of Mexico, deep, deliberate, and unrelenting. Smoke from burning copal incense curled upward into a crimson sky as thousands gathered beneath the towering steps of the Templo Mayor. The scent of blood mixed with flowers. The rhythm of life and death pulsed together, and at its center stood the Aztec priests, their obsidian eyes reflecting both devotion and madness. In this world, pleasure and pain were not opposites. They were offerings, two halves of the same sacred coin. To understand the depravity that would follow, one must first step into the Aztec mind, a civilization that believed the sun itself required nourishment from mortal flesh. Every sunrise was a victory wrestled from chaos, every heartbeat a prayer to gods who demanded blood to keep creation alive. To the Aztecs, the human body was a vessel of divine energy, and sexuality, like sacrifice, was a way of releasing it back to the cosmos. It wasn't indulgence, it was obligation. The priests, wrapped in jaguar skins and dusted with sacred powders, were the chosen mediators between man and God. But their vows of purity hid something darker, a truth that pulsed beneath the temples and in the chambers where no outsider was allowed to tread. There, under moonlight and torch smoke, the lines between worship and sin disappeared. In the name of fertility, in the name of balance, the priests performed acts that would make even their gods recoil. Yet to them it was faith, raw, unfiltered, and terrifyingly beautiful. The Spanish chroniclers who later wrote of these ceremonies could not decide whether they had witnessed religion or madness. One described the scene as a feast of flesh and flame, where the holy and the profane embraced. Another claimed that even the most depraved Roman emperors would have blanched at what was done in the name of devotion here. But to the Aztecs, it was not depravity, it was duty. They lived in a universe where gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. Humans merely continued the tradition. The women chosen for these rituals were not seen as victims, but as vessels of the divine feminine, embodiments of the goddess Xochiyaoyotl or Tlaloc, the purifier of sins through lust. Their bodies became altars, their pleasure a sacred bridge between life and death. Yet every kiss, every caress carried the weight of doom, for the same ritual that sanctified them would also consume them. Imagine the moment. The drums fall silent, the firelight flickers on painted faces, and the high priest raises his hands to the heavens. Around him, dancers move in slow, hypnotic rhythm, their bodies glistening with oil and sweat, decorated with feathers and gold. The air hums with tension, with reverence, with something darker. The priest's voice rises, chanting in Nahuatl, words older than the temples themselves. What follows is not worship in any modern sense. It is surrender, to ecstasy, to fear, to the gods who feast on both. In that world, morality was irrelevant. There was only balance. Life fed death, desire fed divinity. The Aztecs didn't see sin in pleasure or cruelty in sacrifice. They saw cosmic necessity. To deny the gods was to invite the end of all things, the death of the sun, the stilling of the earth, the collapse of reality itself. And so the priests continued, bound by duty, driven by faith, consumed by the same hunger that gave birth to their world. This is not merely a story about sex or ritual. It is about the human need to find meaning in the extremes, the way belief can sanctify even the most unspeakable acts. The Aztec priests believed they were maintaining cosmic order, but in doing so, they crossed a line so deep that even history trembles to look back. In their temples, the body became a battlefield, desire a form of worship, and faith, the darkest addiction of all. To grasp why the Aztecs transformed sex, blood, and death into acts of worship, we must descend into their cosmos, a universe not ruled by morality but by equilibrium. In the Aztec mind, everything existed in cycles, life emerging from decay, beauty from terror, love from loss. The sun itself was not guaranteed, it was a fragile flame that demanded nourishment from human hands. And that nourishment came in the form of sacrifice, not only of flesh but of essence. Their myths began in the darkness before time, when the gods gathered to ignite the fifth sun, the current age of the world. One god leapt into the fire willingly, burning himself alive to become the sun. Another followed to become the moon. Yet the new sun would not move, not until the blood of other gods was spilled in offering. The message was eternal and absolute. Life can only continue through death, creation only through surrender. From this belief flowed every ritual, every blade, every whispered prayer. Sex was no different. In the Aztec worldview, semen and blood were the twin forces of existence, both fluids carrying the sacred spark of creation. The body was a temple but also a field of sacrifice. A man's orgasm mirrored the spilling of blood, a woman's fertility echoed the earth's hunger for renewal. Each act of pleasure was a miniature reenactment of the god's own self-destruction, a holy exchange meant to sustain the balance of the universe. When priests performed sexual rites, they did not imagine themselves as men or even mortals. They became living symbols of divine unity. Their bodies were the channels through which the gods touched the world, instruments through which the heavens were fertilized. The pleasure they sought was not carnal but cosmic. Yet somewhere along that blurred line between piety and passion, the sacred began to rot into the obscene. At the heart of Tenochtitlan stood the temples dedicated to Tlaloc, Huitzilopochtli, and Xochiyaoyotl, gods of rain, war, and renewal. Each demanded offerings tied to their domain. For Tlaloc, tears and water; for Huitzilopochtli, hearts and blood; for Xochiyaoyotl, the flayed skin of the living. But for the gods of fertility and pleasure, Xochiyaoyotl, Tlaloc, and Tezcatlipoca, the offerings were of a different kind. Bodies not merely slain but exalted, virgins not merely honored but defiled in ritual, desire not hidden but performed before the divine. The ceremonies often began at dawn. The city's priests, painted in black ash and sacred pigments, would lead processions through the streets carrying icons adorned with flowers and jade. Musicians played haunting rhythms on bone flutes and drums made of human skin. The people followed in awe, believing that each step of the priests maintained the fragile thread that kept the cosmos alive. Yet behind the temple walls a more secret drama unfolded, one that blurred the line between devotion and delirium. In those dim sanctuaries, the priests invoked the gods of creation, reciting hymns that spoke of divine unions between the heavens and the earth. They reenacted these unions through ritual acts, their bodies painted with symbols of fertility, serpents, maize and water. Some accounts speak of nights where priests and temple maidens danced naked beneath torches, mimicking the cosmic lovemaking of gods long dead. Others describe priests consuming sacred plants, entering trances where they believed themselves transformed. Their bodies no longer human, their minds merged with celestial beings. Every gesture, every movement was laden with cosmic weight. The act of arousal itself was seen as a summoning, a reminder of the gods' power to create and destroy. The priests believed that through controlled ecstasy, they could channel divine energy into the world, ensuring harvests, fertility, and the continuation of the sun's path across the sky. But to achieve this, they had to walk a razor's edge between sanctity and corruption. Therein lies the paradox. The same faith that demanded purity also demanded transgression. To become vessels of the gods, priests had to abandon the boundaries of human morality. Lust became prayer, pain became offering. Their bodies ceased to belong to themselves, they were instruments of a cosmic machinery that required constant feeding. The more they gave, the more they lost. And somewhere, in the hidden chambers of the temple, the distinction between holiness and hunger collapsed entirely. This was the essence of Aztec spirituality, a world where creation demanded violation, and beauty could not exist without cruelty. It was not evil in their eyes but necessity. To sustain the universe, one must feed it with what is most precious: blood, pleasure, and faith. To deny this cycle would be to deny existence itself. And so, generation after generation, the Aztec priests continued their rituals, their songs rising into the smoky heavens, their bodies trembling in the dance between life and annihilation. The gods, they believed, watched and hungered. And the priests, ever devoted, offered themselves, again and again, to keep the sun burning in the sky. In the shadowed corridors of the great temple, where the scent of dried blood clung to the stones, there stood a shrine unlike any other, the sanctuary of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. He was not a god of mercy or light, but of temptation, chaos, and hidden truth. His obsidian mirror showed not the future but the self, stripped of illusion. To the Aztecs, he was the god who tested men with desire, who whispered in their hearts until virtue cracked and the beast within emerged. To his priests he was both master and mirror. They lived austere lives by daylight. Heads shaved, robes blackened with soot, they walked barefoot through the streets, fasting and bleeding themselves in acts of devotion. They were feared and revered, said to be capable of reading men's souls, of seeing lies reflected in their god's smoky glass. But when night fell, when the drums slowed and the city's torches guttered low, a different kind of ceremony began. Tezcatlipoca demanded offerings of the flesh, not merely the heart. His priests believed that to commune with him fully, they had to embrace every human weakness, lust, envy, indulgence, and then destroy themselves through it. To deny the darkness within was to insult the God who ruled over it. And so, hidden beneath the temple's black banners, they performed rites that blurred piety and perversion until they were indistinguishable. The rituals often began with a mirror. A great disk of polished obsidian placed at the center of the chamber, surrounded by offerings, feathers, bones, pulque and flowers. The priests would gather around it, their faces painted half white, half black, symbolizing duality, purity and sin, order and chaos. They chanted in low, trembling voices, calling upon Tezcatlipoca to reveal himself. The mirror's surface caught the flickering light of torches, creating the illusion of movement. A shadow within smoke, a face behind reflection. A chosen youth or virgin, believed to be the god's living vessel, was brought forward. They were adorned in jewels and gold, treated as divine for a year, fed, worshipped and desired. On this night, they were stripped of ornaments, anointed with oil and sacred herbs, and made to stand before the mirror. The high priest would approach, holding a blade of obsidian not as a weapon but as a symbol of penetration, of unveiling. The ritual that followed was a performance of power and surrender, meant to symbolize the god's seduction of the world and the destruction that always followed pleasure. Spanish chroniclers, horrified yet fascinated, wrote of these ceremonies with trembling quills. One claimed the priests committed acts that defy decency, while another described the rituals as marriages of death and desire. Yet to the Aztec mind, nothing in these acts was shameful. Each thrust, each touch, each drop of sweat and blood was an offering. It was believed that through controlled corruption they could transcend it, that by diving into the pit of desire, one might emerge purified. The high priest, often intoxicated on sacred pulque and hallucinogenic herbs, would enter a trance. He would stare into the mirror until his reflection dissolved, until he saw not his face but that of Tezcatlipoca. At that moment he believed he was no longer himself. He was the god, the embodiment of night, the bringer of temptation, the destroyer of hypocrisy. In that state he performed the ritual union, sometimes with the living, sometimes symbolically with the image in the mirror, merging spirit and flesh in a dance of shadows. But the ritual never ended in ecstasy. It always ended in sacrifice. The chosen vessel, after the act, was slain, their heart cut from their chest, their body displayed upon the temple. The logic was brutal yet poetic. No pleasure without pain, no life without death. The moment of climax was both the height of devotion and the instant of doom. In death, the vessel's spirit was believed to ascend and serve the god eternally, while their body returned to the earth, nourishing it with divine essence. The priests who survived these nights were changed. Some went mad, speaking to mirrors that no longer reflected their faces. Others became ascetics, mutilating themselves to atone for the ecstasies they could not forget. Yet all believed they had glimpsed the truth, that within every human heart lies a mirror, and in that mirror the god of temptation waits. Tezcatlipoca's priests became symbols of contradiction, men who preached restraint yet practiced indulgence, who sought purity through desecration. Their temples stood as monuments to paradox, the holiest places of worship hiding the darkest chambers of sin. But even the Spanish conquerors who sought to erase their memory could not destroy the idea they represented, that within every act of faith there lingers desire, and within every desire, a shadow of divinity. For the Aztecs, the smoking mirror was not merely a god, he was a reflection of the soul itself. And in their desperate attempts to appease him, the priests revealed an eternal human truth, that sometimes the path to heaven winds straight through hell. If Tezcatlipoca ruled over shadow and temptation, then Xochiyaoyotl reigned in light and bloom. She was the goddess of beauty, love and sensual pleasure, the eternal maiden who laughed at death and danced through the gardens of paradise. Yet even her worship was not untouched by the darkness that defined Aztec faith. For in this world, beauty was never innocent, and desire was never free. To love a goddess meant to destroy her reflection, and so the virgins of Xochiyaoyotl were adored, worshipped, and finally offered to the flames. They called them the blossoms of the goddess. Chosen as children for their purity and grace, these girls were raised within temple walls, untouched by the world. Their hair was perfumed with copal smoke, their skin painted with flowers and gold dust. They were taught songs, dances and sacred rituals of fertility. The people adored them for they symbolized renewal, the promise of harvest, the continuation of life. But behind that beauty lay a cruel truth. Their destiny was not to live but to die beautifully. The ceremony of Xochiyautl's feast began each year in the month of Huitzilopochtli, when the rains returned and the maize sprouted from the earth. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of blossoms heavy and intoxicating. At dawn, the chosen virgin, often no older than 16, was adorned in feathers, jade and garlands of marigold. Her body became the embodiment of the goddess herself. She was not merely dressed as Xochiyaoyotl, she was believed to become her. The procession that followed was a spectacle of both ecstasy and dread. Thousands lined the streets, throwing petals beneath her feet. Drums pounded like a heartbeat, flutes whispered in high, mournful tones. Men wept openly as she passed, their tears falling like rain. To them, she was the flower of creation, the vessel of divine beauty that made all life possible. Yet everyone knew how it would end. That knowledge, that exquisite tension between adoration and doom, was what gave the ritual its terrible power. In the temple courtyard, the girl would dance before the altar, her movements slow and graceful, echoing the motions of the wind through flowers. Priests circled her, chanting in deep tones that rose and fell like waves. As she danced, her ornaments were removed one by one, the gold, the jade, the feathers, until she stood wearing only garlands and paint. Each removal was symbolic, stripping away the mortal world, revealing the pure divine beneath. The moment was sacred, but the air trembled with desire. Spanish witnesses would later write that the ritual contained acts of strange intimacy, gestures between the priests and the maiden that blurred reverence with lust. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, they reflect the undeniable tension within the rite, the collision of holiness and hunger. The priests, sworn to chastity, stood face to face with the living embodiment of erotic divinity. To touch her was to defile the sacred, yet to resist her was to deny the goddess. It was a paradox that no mortal could escape unscathed. As night descended, the music grew louder, faster, almost frantic. Torches painted the temple walls in gold and crimson. The maiden, now exhausted and trembling, was led to the altar. There, the high priest anointed her with pulque and honey, symbols of life and sweetness. She was offered a cup of sacred drink, a mixture of herbs and hallucinogens, meant to ease her passage. Then, with chants echoing into the darkness, she lay down upon the stone slab. The moment before death was the most important. The Aztecs believed the goddess's spirit entered her body at that instant, tasting the mortal world through her senses. Every sigh, every tear, every flicker of fear was divine. As the blade of obsidian descended, the drums stopped. Silence consumed the temple. And then, as her blood spilled, the people erupted in cries, not of horror but of worship. Her death was not an end but a beginning. Through her sacrifice, the goddess was reborn, the fields would bloom and love would once again walk the earth. Her body, still adorned with flowers, was later buried beneath the temple garden. From that soil, priests claimed, the most vibrant blossoms would grow, red and gold, nourished by divine essence. Those flowers were woven into crowns for future maidens, continuing the cycle of life, beauty, and annihilation. The women of Xochiyaotl's cult lived in the shadow of this ritual. They were revered as sacred but forbidden to love, their lives spent in chastity until the goddess called them. Some rebelled, seeking secret lovers, and for them the punishment was swift. Their bodies were broken, their names erased. Others submitted fully, embracing their role as living offerings. Their serenity was haunting, a quiet acceptance of a fate that blurred martyrdom and ecstasy. To outsiders it might seem barbaric, the idea of killing beauty to honor it. But to the Aztecs, this was the highest expression of devotion. What greater gift could one offer the gods than the most perfect form of life, destroyed in its prime so that the world could endure? In their eyes, the maiden's death was not cruelty, it was the flowering of faith itself. And perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all, that the people who built one of the most magnificent civilizations on earth also believed that love could only exist through sacrifice. In their world, beauty and death were not enemies. They were lovers, forever entwined, dancing in the firelight as the drums echoed into eternity. The festival of Tezcatlipoca, the flaying of men, was not merely a ritual, it was the very heartbeat of the Aztec spring. It marked the renewal of life through the shedding of flesh, a sacred act dedicated to Xochiyaoyotl, the god who renewed the earth by stripping himself of skin. To the Aztecs, flaying was not horror, it was transformation. When the rains came, the old husk of the world was peeled away, revealing the new beneath. But in this festival, renewal was enacted not on crops, but on human bodies. And beneath its surface of divine symbolism, there pulsed something more primal, a merging of violence, desire, and rebirth that few civilizations have dared to imagine. At dawn, the city awoke to drums that sounded like the beating of an enormous heart. Prisoners taken in battle, young, strong, and unbroken, were dressed as gods, painted in bright yellow and crimson. They were not victims. They were honored as divine substitutes, walking embodiments of Xochiyaoyotl himself. The people cheered as these god-men, paraded through the streets, their bodies gleaming with oil and gold. Women threw flowers at them, weeping and laughing as if greeting returning lovers. The air was thick with celebration, yet beneath the joy lurked dread, for everyone knew what the day would bring. The captives were led to the Great Pyramid, where priests awaited in ceremonial attire, their faces hidden behind flayed skins from the previous year's sacrifices. The sight was both mesmerizing and nauseating, the dead flesh clinging to living men, the faint odor of decay blending with incense. These priests were the living masks of Xochiyaoyotl, embodying the cycle of death and renewal. To wear another's skin was to assume their essence, to absorb their life. As they ascended the steps, their movements slow and ritualistic, the crowd fell silent. What followed was a dance of divine imitation. The chosen victims were positioned before the idol of Xochiyaoyotl, their arms bound, their eyes painted black to symbolize the night before rebirth. The high priest raised his obsidian blade, sharper than steel, capable of slicing flesh like silk, and plunged it into the victim's chest. The heart was torn free, still beating, and offered to the god amid cries that echoed across the city. Blood streamed down the steps, glistening in the sunlight like liquid rubies. The body, still warm, was carefully flayed from neck to thigh. But the ritual did not end there. The skin, now sacred, was handed to a priest or a chosen warrior, who would drape it over himself like a second body. The newly reborn man was called Tezcatlipoca, the living image of the god. For 20 days he would wear the skin, walking among the people as Xochiyaoyotl reborn. Wherever he went, others bowed, kissed the hem of the rotting flesh, and whispered prayers for fertility and renewal. The grotesque became holy. The smell of decay became the scent of life. In some accounts, the flayed skins were used in mock weddings, symbolic unions between life and death. The priest wearing the skin would marry the wife of the slain man, performing ritual gestures of intimacy before the idol. The act was not considered adultery, for both were believed to be possessed by divine forces. The priest was no longer a man, he was Xochiyaoyotl. The woman no longer a widow, she was the earth herself, embracing the god who would fertilize her once again. The scene, erotic, tragic, and sacred, reflected the Aztec belief that fertility could only arise through destruction, that love itself was a kind of sacrifice. 4 days the festival continued. The flayed priests performed public dances, their limbs heavy beneath the drying skins, their movements awkward yet hypnotic. Children laughed and threw petals, merchants offered gifts, warriors painted their faces in the colors of blood and maize. It was a celebration of paradox, joy born from death, pleasure from agony. When the sun burned high, the priests would sit in the market, accepting offerings as people touched the hanging folds of skin for blessings. Mothers pressed their infants against it, praying for health, lovers sought it for fertility, farmers for rain. Behind the temple walls, however, more secret rites took place. Spanish chroniclers later whispered of unions performed in the name of Xochiyaoyotl, ceremonies where the act of flaying was mimicked symbolically between man and woman, representing the shedding of mortal skin for spiritual rebirth. Whether these stories were literal or metaphorical remains uncertain, but they reveal a psychological truth, that for the Aztecs, sexuality and sacrifice were threads of the same weave. Both required surrender. Both sought to touch the divine through the destruction of the self. When the 20 days ended, the priests removed the decayed skins and buried them beneath the temple. The smell of rot was unbearable, but to the Aztecs, it was sacred. The odor of rebirth, proof that the gods had fed and the cycle would continue. The men who had worn the skins were considered reborn, purified through corruption. Their service was complete, they had lived as gods and returned as men. To modern eyes, the ritual seems monstrous, almost inhuman. But to the Aztecs, it was the ultimate expression of cosmic balance, a living enactment of nature's law. The seed must split to grow, the snake must shed its skin to survive. Life was not possible without the tearing away of old flesh. And so they flayed and wore, loved and killed, prayed and bled, never out of cruelty but out of conviction that the universe demanded it. The festival of Tezcatlipoca stands as one of the most haunting reflections of human faith, a world where death wore the face of renewal, and where the sacred and the sensual could never be untangled. It was a reminder that in the heart of beauty lies decay, and in the depths of horror, the promise of rebirth. The Aztec priests knew this truth intimately, they lived it, breathed it, and bled it, until even their own humanity had been stripped away, leaving only what the gods desired, the raw, shining essence beneath the skin. When the sun fell behind the obsidian temples and the city of Tenochtitlan was swallowed by darkness, The priests prepared for the most forbidden of all ceremonies, the Night of the Gods. It was said that in these secret hours, when mortals slept and only the stars bore witness, the boundary between man and divinity dissolved. The rituals that took place were whispered of even among the Aztecs with awe and fear, for they were not meant for mortal eyes. They were not sacrifices of blood but of spirit, offerings made through pleasure, intoxication, and divine madness. The Night of the Gods was held only on sacred dates, when the stars aligned with the temples of Tlaloc and Tezcatlipoca. It began in silence. Inside the high sanctum of the temple, the walls were painted with celestial symbols, serpents devouring the sun, moons opening like flowers. The air shimmered with incense and the pulsing rhythm of drums that beat like slow heartbeats of the earth itself. Naked flames flickered against the murals, revealing priests whose faces were painted white and black, half purity, half corruption. They had fasted for days, denying themselves food and sleep to purge the body. And now, in the quiet between worlds, they would invite the gods to inhabit their flesh. At the center of the chamber stood a great circular stone carved with symbols of creation. Upon it lay offerings, pulque, cacao, bones, jade, and the hearts of quails. The priests gathered in a circle, chanting in deep, guttural tones that rose and fell like the breathing of the earth. Their voices blended with the hum of drums until sound itself became a living thing. The atmosphere thickened, heavy with the mingling scent of blood, smoke, and sweat. They believed that to open the gateway between the worlds, the body must be unbound, freed from fear, shame, and form. Into this sacred chaos stepped the Xochiyaoyotl, the living embodiment of the goddess or god chosen for the rite. Sometimes a young maiden painted in gold to represent Xochiyaoyotl, other times a chosen youth to embody Tezcatlipoca. They moved slowly, their eyes half closed, their skin gleaming beneath the torchlight. To the priests, they were not human, they were divine vessels into which the gods themselves had descended. The participants surrounded them, offering chants and gestures that mimicked creation itself, the separation of heaven and earth, the union of light and shadow. At the height of the ritual, the intoxicants took hold. Pulque mixed with hallucinogenic mushrooms blurred the senses, and the chanting became wild, almost animalistic. The priests moved in rhythm, shedding their robes until only their painted bodies gleamed in the red light. The circle closed around the divine vessel. What followed was not spoken of directly even in Aztec codices, it was described only through symbols. Serpents coiling, rivers flowing, flowers opening under moonlight. These were metaphors for the sacred act of union, a merging of mortal and divine flesh meant to rekindle the cosmic fire. To outsiders it would appear as ritualized orgy, but to the Aztecs it was transcendence. Every movement, every gasp, every drop of sweat was an offering, the body becoming prayer, the act itself a chant of creation. Pleasure was not sin, it was sacrifice. In those moments the priests believed the gods entered their flesh, breathing through their mouths, feeling through their hands. When the ritual reached its climax, a silence fell, deep, absolute, and terrifying. It was said that in that instant the gods looked back through the eyes of the priests, and the line between worshipper and deity vanished. The aftermath was as solemn as the act itself. The participants lay motionless, trembling, tears mixing with the oils on their skin. The high priest would rise and cut his arm, letting his blood drip onto the stone, a symbolic sealing of the union. The divine vessel, now emptied of the god's essence, would be led away to rest or in some cases to die, for to embody a god was to burn too brightly for too long. Death for them was release. These ceremonies were never witnessed by commoners. They were confined to the highest echelons of the priesthood, their details guarded with threats of death. Yet stories leaked, whispers of nights where the boundaries of flesh dissolved, where men became gods through forbidden ecstasy. The Spanish, upon hearing of them, branded them diabolical congresses, mistaking mysticism for sin. But to the Aztecs they were acts of cosmic duty. In their eyes, if the sun was to rise, if the maize was to grow, if the rain was to fall, then the gods must be awakened through every part of creation, through pain, blood, and yes, through desire. Each element of the ritual carried meaning. The pulque represented divine intoxication, the chaos of creation. The mushrooms were the bridge between worlds. The union of bodies symbolized the birth of the cosmos, just as the gods had once torn themselves apart to create existence. And the silence after climax, that was the void before rebirth. It was believed that during this silence time itself paused. The universe held its breath, listening to the heartbeat of humanity echo through the temple. Some of the oldest codices describe how, during the ritual, priests reported visions of serpents made of fire, of stars falling into oceans, of the gods themselves walking among them. These were seen as proof that the barrier between heaven and earth had truly broken. Yet such visions came with a cost. Many priests emerged shattered, their minds frayed by what they had seen. Some wandered into the wilderness, speaking to the wind, claiming the gods still whispered in their ears. And yet, every cycle, the ceremony was repeated. The same songs, the same fire, the same surrender. For in their world, desire was not the enemy of faith, it was its fuel. The priests of Tenochtitlan believed that the divine could not be reached through denial, but through total surrender to experience. To feel fully was to pray deeply. To burn completely was to be reborn. The Night of the Gods was the Aztecs' most daring attempt to touch eternity, an act of devotion that walked the knife's edge between holiness and heresy. And though the temples that once housed these ceremonies have long turned to dust, the echo of those nights remains, haunting the ruins. In the dark corridors where torchlight once flickered and breath once trembled, the air still seems to pulse, as if the gods, long forgotten, still remember the touch of human hands. The Aztecs believed that life was a fragile equilibrium between two sacred forces, blood and seed. One was the essence of death, the other of creation, and both were equally divine. To sustain the cosmos, both had to be given freely. The priests spoke of them not as opposites but as brothers, twin rivers flowing from the body into the earth, feeding the gods who in turn sustained all existence. It was said that when blood was spilled in sacrifice, the heavens drank deeply. When seed was spilled in ritual, the earth itself awakened. Both were acts of worship. Both were sacred currency in the endless cycle of giving and taking. In the codices preserved by Spanish friars, there are passages describing ceremonies in which these forces were combined, blood and semen mixed together as offerings to the gods of fertility. To the Christian chroniclers this was blasphemy. But to the Aztec mind, it was purity itself, the perfect union of life's two most powerful energies. The heart's essence and the body's pleasure met in one sacred vessel. For them, the cosmos was alive with sensuality. The rain was the tears of Tlaloc, the earth the womb of Tenantzin, and the lightning of phallic burst from the heavens fertilizing the ground below. Every storm was an act of love, every harvest a consequence of divine coupling. In this worldview, human sexuality was not shameful, it was a mirror of the universe. The act of copulation was seen as the reenactment of creation, the joining of masculine sun and feminine earth, of sky and soil, of life and decay. Priests and priestesses performed rituals to mimic this cosmic dance, their movements choreographed to the rhythms of flutes and drums. Every gesture, every touch was symbolic, the opening of petals, the flowing of rivers, the rising of dawn. But the rituals were never simple acts of pleasure. They were dangerous, sacred exchanges that demanded payment, often in blood. Among the most secret rites was the Tlayahuac, the Night of Seeds. During this ceremony, the high priests invoked the gods of fertility, offering drops of their own blood drawn from the tongue or genitals, mingling it with the seed of life. This mixture was placed upon the altars of Tlaloc and Xochiyaoyotl, sprinkled over the fields, or even consumed in sacred drinks. They believed it carried the spark of divine renewal, that through it, they could ignite the forces of growth and abundance across the land. The act itself was not seen as obscene but as deeply spiritual, a reenactment of the first creation, when the gods themselves tore open their bodies to bring forth the world. Spanish missionaries were horrified. They wrote of priests defiling the holy places with fluids of impurity, yet even they could not deny the power of what they saw. The Aztecs were performing the most primal of human functions as cosmic prayer. Their faith was not built on denial of the flesh but on its complete surrender. In their temples, desire and devotion became indistinguishable. And while Europeans sought salvation through restraint, the Aztecs sought it through release, through the total offering of the self to the gods who created them. One chronicler described an underground chamber beneath the temple of Xochiyaoyotl where only select priests entered. There, he claimed, they performed secret rites combining dance, intoxication, and the spilling of blood and seed upon the earth's effigies. The chamber's walls were painted with scenes of creation, the gods splitting their bodies open, the sky fertilizing the sea, the earth giving birth to flame. Whether these accounts were true or exaggerated by Christian minds disgusted by foreign worship, they reveal the same truth, that to the Aztecs, holiness was inseparable from the body. Psychologically, these rituals reflected an extraordinary understanding of the human condition. The Aztecs saw desire not as sin, but as the pulse of existence itself. To repress it was to deny the gods who embodied it. They believed that only by embracing their hunger, by offering it, not hiding it, could they maintain harmony in the universe. The spilling of blood symbolized death's inevitability, the spilling of seed, life's persistence. The priest stood between these two forces, mediating the eternal exchange that kept creation alive. But this balance carried a price. The priests who participated in such ceremonies often paid with their sanity or their lives. The intensity of these experiences, physical, emotional, and spiritual, broke many of them. Some retreated into caves, mutilating themselves to purge the visions of ecstasy they could not unsee. Others became obsessed, repeating the rituals in secret, convinced that the gods demanded more. In their pursuit of divine perfection, they lost themselves, consumed by the very energies they sought to control. Still, the ideology endured because it was rooted in nature itself. The Aztecs lived in a world of contrasts: sun and storm, feast and famine, life and decay. To them, the merging of blood and seed was simply an acknowledgement of what the world already knew, that everything alive feeds upon death and everything that dies gives life. It was not depravity but understanding, a philosophy written in flesh rather than ink. Perhaps this is why, despite the horror it inspires today, the ritual remains profoundly human. Beneath its violence and eroticism lies an ancient truth, that creation is always born from destruction, and that to give oneself completely, even in the most primal way, is to touch the divine. In the shadows of the temples, where torches flickered and chants echoed like heartbeats, the priests offered not just their blood or their seed, but their very being. And as the night wind carried their songs across the lake, it was said that even the stars seemed to pulse in rhythm, as if the heavens themselves were moved by the mingling of human desire and sacred sacrifice. The fall of the Aztec faith did not come with thunder from the heavens but with whispers, fire, and disease. When the Spaniards arrived in 1519, the gods of Tenochtitlan had already begun to tremble. The omens were many: comets tearing through the sky, temples catching fire without cause, women weeping in the night. The priests knew something immense was approaching. They believed the gods were sending warnings, not of punishment but of change. Yet they could not imagine the scale of what was coming, nor how quickly the sacred order that had defined their world for centuries would collapse into silence. When Hernán Cortés and his men entered the valley, the Aztec Empire was at its height, vast, glittering, and filled with ritual life. The Spaniards saw the temples rising like mountains of stone, their stairways wet with blood, their courtyards echoing with drums. To them this was hell dressed as paradise. They could not comprehend a faith in which sacrifice and sensuality were divine duties. Their own religion preached purity, restraint, and sin. The Aztecs' faith, to their eyes, was a blasphemy beyond imagination. And so, in the name of salvation, they vowed to destroy it. But the conquest did not begin with swords. It began with fascination. Many conquistadors were entranced by what they saw: the gold, the music, the people who walked with such poise even in chains. Some wrote that the beauty of the Aztec temples rivaled anything in Spain. The priests of Tenochtitlan watched these foreigners with curiosity, interpreting their pale faces and shining weapons as signs of divine power. Some believed they were emissaries of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, returning from the east as prophecy foretold. That fatal misreading sealed their fate. The Spaniards entered Tenochtitlan as guests. They dined with Emperor Moctezuma, were shown the sacred precincts, and even witnessed small public rituals: bloodletting, dancing, chanting. But what lay behind the temple walls remained hidden. The night of the gods, the flaying festivals, the sexual ceremonies, none of these could be revealed. The priests sensed danger. They knew the stranger's god was one of judgment, not balance. Yet they underestimated the zeal of the cross. Soon the Spaniards demanded that the sacrifices cease. They ordered the idols to be removed, the temples to be cleansed. When the Aztec priests refused, claiming that the world would die without the offerings, the conquistadors saw only heathen defiance. Their friars called it devil worship. What the Aztecs considered sacred energy, the Europeans called sin. What the Aztecs saw as renewal, the Spaniards saw as corruption. Neither side could understand the other, and so, misunderstanding became massacre. The turning point came during the festival of Tezcatlipoca, when the people gathered to honor Tezcatlipoca with song and dance. The Spanish soldiers, fearing rebellion, surrounded the temple and struck. They cut down dancers, priests and children alike, their swords flashing under the sun. Blood pooled where once flowers had been laid. The sacred drums fell silent. In that moment, the gods of the Aztecs, or perhaps their faith in them, began to die. After the massacre, rebellion erupted. The people fought fiercely, but disease, starvation, and betrayal weakened them. By the time the last defenders fell in 1521, The city was a ruin of smoke and ash. The temples that once touched the sky now lay broken. The Spaniards built churches atop the sacred pyramids, their bells ringing where drums once called to the gods. The smell of incense was replaced by that of gunpowder and rot. Yet even amid conquest the old faith refused to vanish entirely. The Spaniards could destroy the idols but not the memories. In secret, the remaining priests and priestesses continued their rites, muted, fragmented, disguised beneath Christian forms. The festivals of fertility became the feasts of saints. Offerings of blood became offerings of wine. The goddess Tenantzin was reborn as the Virgin of Guadalupe, her image dark-skinned and radiant, standing on the crescent moon just as the ancient mother once had. The gods had been conquered, but they had also adapted. Beneath the surface of colonial piety, the old rhythms still pulsed. Among the conquered people, whispers persisted about the forbidden nights, the rituals once performed in the depths of the temples, when men and gods had mingled through ecstasy and blood. Some said the priests had fled to the mountains, carrying the sacred mirrors of Tezcatlipoca. Others believed that at certain times of year, when the rains came and lightning struck the lakes, the gods returned in spirit, demanding their old offerings. Farmers claimed to hear drumming beneath the earth during storms, as if the heart of Tenochtitlan still beat far below the Spanish churches. The friars, alarmed by these rumors, began hunting for hidden altars. They found shrines behind walls, buried idols, small clay figures of gods smeared with chicken blood or pulque. Each discovery brought punishment: whippings, executions, forced baptisms. Yet for every idol they burned, another was carved in secret. Faith, once burned into the flesh of a people, cannot be erased by decree. It only changes form, it hides, it waits, it transforms. In the decades that followed, the forbidden elements of the old religion fused with the new. The dances once performed for Xochiyaoyotl were now offered to the Virgin Mary during festivals, though their movements still spoke of fertility and union. The flaying ceremonies of Xochiyaoyotl became masked dances in which men symbolically shed their sins. Even the sensuality of the old rites survived in whispers, in songs, in poetry, in the way lovers painted each other's bodies with flowers during celebrations. The sensual and the sacred remained entwined, though hidden beneath layers of fear. To the Spanish chroniclers, these remnants were proof of stubborn idolatry. To modern eyes, they were acts of survival. The Aztec priests who once walked among flames and desire now lived as peasants, healers, and storytellers. They told their children of the old gods, not as deities but as spirits of the land. They said that every mountain, every river, every storm still carried a memory of sacrifice. The people learned to speak the prayers of the church with their lips, but their hearts whispered older names. The fall of faith, then, was not a simple destruction. It was a metamorphosis, brutal, painful, yet strangely enduring. For centuries, the Spaniards tried to bury the Aztec gods under cathedrals and catechisms, but those gods simply changed masks. Tezcatlipoca hid behind the crucifix's shadow. Xochiyaoyotl bloomed again in the Virgin's robes. The rituals of flesh and blood, stripped of their open display, became inward. Desire, once offered to the gods through ceremony, was now repressed, turned inward, twisted by guilt. The Aztecs, once at peace with the duality of creation and destruction, now learned to fear their own nature. And that fear, born of conquest, would linger for generations. Yet not all was lost. In the hidden villages of the highlands, some still sang to the old gods by moonlight. They offered maize, flowers, and drops of pulque to the earth, whispering words that had not been spoken aloud since the empire fell. Tlaloc, give us rain. Tenantzin, give us life. Xochiyaoyotl, let us be renewed. There were no more flayings, no more sexual rites, but the essence, the yearning to connect with the divine through the body, survived. The sacred and the sensual, once condemned as depravity, found new life in song and art. By the 17th century, Spanish chroniclers began to note something they could not explain. Despite conversion, despite centuries of Christian dominance, the people of Mexico retained a peculiar reverence for blood, for sacrifice, for the union of suffering and beauty. In their festivals, saints were depicted bleeding. Their faith found holiness in pain. Some friars began to fear that the Aztec gods had not died at all, that they had simply donned Christian faces. The duality that had defined the old religion, life and death, desire and purification, had survived by merging with the conqueror's faith. And perhaps, in a cruel irony, this fusion was the ultimate revenge of the conquered. The gods of the Aztecs, once fed by human hearts, were now fed by human belief itself. They lived on in every church that rose atop a pyramid, in every hymn that echoed with the cadence of old chants, in every candle lit for the Virgin whose eyes still gleamed like those of Xochiyaoyotl. The conquerors had tried to silence the drums, but they could not silence the pulse within the human soul, the longing to touch divinity through flesh, to find eternity in ecstasy and sacrifice alike. By the time the Spaniards had fully secured their empire, the Aztec priests were long gone, executed, enslaved, or broken. Yet their shadow remained. Beneath the cobblestones of Mexico City lie the bones of temples, the altars where blood and seed once mingled, the stones that once trembled beneath chants of forbidden union. Scholars excavating those ruins centuries later would find carvings still red with pigment, depicting gods entwined, lovers burning, serpents shedding skin. The artistry was exquisite, but its message was haunting. Everything that lives must die, and everything that dies must live again. So ended the faith of the Aztec priests, not with a final scream but with a slow fading sigh. Yet their legacy endures, not only in ruins or history books, but in the human condition itself. For their rituals, however extreme, were born from something deeply human, the desire to find meaning in pain, to make beauty out of terror, to reach for the divine through the very instincts that define us. The Spaniards destroyed their temples, but not the truths carved into their hearts, that creation demands sacrifice, that love is bound to death, and that the line between holiness and sin is as thin as a drop of blood. In the centuries that followed, poets and painters would rediscover this duality. They would look upon the ruins of the Templo Mayor and see not savagery but mystery, a civilization that dared to look at the gods and say, "Take all of me." And perhaps that is what the Aztec priests understood best, that faith, when stripped of fear, becomes the most dangerous form of love. Even in ruin, even in conquest, even in silence, the echo of their prayers remains, a heartbeat beneath the earth, a whisper that says the gods are never truly gone, only waiting for the next offering. The city that once burned with drums and divine ecstasy now sleeps beneath stone and steel. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the cathedrals, the asphalt, and the hum of modern Mexico, the blood of the old world still stirs. It whispers through the cracks of the ruins, through the flowers that grow where sacrifices once fell, through the dreams of those who still feel a pulse older than history. The Aztec gods, the priests, the lovers, the maidens, all are gone. But their shadows are not. They linger, eternal and uneasy, in the human psyche, reminding us that we have never truly left the age of blood and desire. Centuries after the conquest, people still return to the ruins of the Templo Mayor. Tourists see stones, scholars see symbols, but the air itself remembers. At dusk, when the light turns gold and the city quiets, the temple's foundation seems to hum, as if the earth beneath still remembers the rhythm of flutes and the pounding of drums. Those who linger say the wind carries a faint chant in Nahuatl, a whisper of the old prayers. Feed the gods, it seems to say, so they may feed you. And though no more sacrifices are made, the idea itself still binds us, the ancient human truth that nothing comes without offering. In modern life, the same instincts have simply changed masks. The temples are gone, but we still build altars, to power, to beauty, to fame. We still offer pieces of ourselves to unseen gods, though we call them by new names. We sacrifice time, innocence, love, and still, somewhere deep within, we crave transcendence through pleasure and pain. The Aztec priests may have clothed their hunger in feathers and incense, but our hunger is the same. We too seek meaning in the extremes, we too long to make sense of suffering, we too are drawn to the forbidden, if only to feel alive. In this way, the Aztecs were not monsters, they were mirrors. Their rituals, however shocking, reflected a truth that civilization often tries to bury, that the sacred and the carnal have always been entwined. To deny one is to deform the other. They understood that beauty and horror are twins, that creation and destruction share the same heartbeat. It is a truth that modern man has forgotten, though it still lives in our art, our stories, our obsessions. Every film that glorifies violence, every song that aches for forbidden love, every tear shed at beauty's fleetingness, all are echoes of those same ancient rites. In the quiet hours of night, the question remains, what truly separates us from them? We may not wield obsidian knives, but we still cut ourselves open in pursuit of meaning. We sacrifice in invisible temples, our bodies, our time, our dreams, believing that something greater will come from it. We may not call it faith, but it is. We have simply replaced gods of stone with gods of desire, ambition, and memory. The blood we spill now is not on altars, but in wars, in heartbreak, in the endless hunger to be seen and to belong. The fall of the Aztecs, then, was not an ending but a transformation, not of gods but of the human soul. Their ceremonies have become our metaphors, their myths our psychology. Tezcatlipoca's mirror now exists in every screen that reflects our image back to us. Dark, seductive, judgmental. Xochiyaotl's dance continues in the eternal struggle between beauty and decay, between innocence and surrender. Even Xochiyaotl lives on, in the way we shed our skins, identities, personas, names, to become something new. We wear our own masks of renewal and call it progress, but beneath it all beats the same ancient rhythm. Those who study the Aztecs often ask how such brilliance and brutality could coexist. But perhaps the answer is simple: they did not see them as opposites. To them, pain was not evil, it was necessary. Death was not the end, it was a doorway. Pleasure was not shameful, it was divine. In their temples they confronted what modern civilization runs from: the truth that life feeds on life, and that all creation demands destruction. They did not hide from this, they sanctified it. And in doing so they left behind a legacy both horrifying and awe-inspiring. A civilization that dared to look at the abyss and call it holy. Today, when we gaze upon the ruins, we are haunted not only by what they did, but by what they understood. Their darkness forces us to confront our own, the part of the human heart that finds beauty in chaos, that seeks transcendence in the forbidden. Perhaps that is why their story still grips us, because within their cruelty lies something familiar. The priests of Tenochtitlan may have spoken in tongues now lost, but their prayers still reach us through time, whispering a message we recognize in our bones, that the divine is not found in denial, but in the surrender to what we truly are. And so, the legacy of the Aztec priests endures, not in ritual but in remembrance. Every time we face the unknown, every time we confront the darkness within ourselves, we honor them, knowingly or not. They remind us that humanity's greatest terror and greatest beauty come from the same source: our hunger for meaning in a world built on impermanence. Their ceremonies are gone, their gods buried, but the heartbeat of their faith still echoes in every human who has ever loved too deeply, feared too greatly, or sacrificed too much. Because in the end, the Aztecs were not worshipping cruelty, they were worshipping the truth that life itself is cruel, yet magnificent. And if you listen closely, beneath the hum of the modern city, beneath the chatter and engines and neon lights, you can still hear it: the faint pulse of drums, the breath of forgotten priests, the rhythm of hearts that once believed they could keep the sun alive. It is the sound of faith, raw and unashamed. It is the sound of the human soul remembering that somewhere between pleasure and pain, between blood and seed, between holiness and hunger, the gods are still waiting,